All right, so for folks at home, we're starting our fifth class on Plato's Republic. What I'm going to do, and for all of you, I'm going to do a quick review of where we are in the argument so far so we can bring ourselves up to speed, all right? So this whole book is trying to answer one fundamental question: why bother being good if you could get away with being bad? For the sake of the argument, we grant the premise that you could get away with being bad. In a pagan landscape, this is believable because the gods are not omniscient, they're not omnibenevolent, they're not omnipotent. So there might be ways to sort of, engineer around them. They might not see things. You might be able to use spells or secret tricks to get around their attention. Or a ring, or Hades' cap, another ancient device that you could use to evade the vision of gods and men. And so the point is, if you could wear a ring that turned you completely invisible, and you would therefore not be accountable for anything that you did because no one could see you doing it, how would you behave? Right? In our version of it, it's, what do you do when no one's looking? And if the answer is substantially different from what you give when people are looking, and I'm not talking about intimate relations between spouses, that obviously is set apart, right? Then you're like, yeah, why is that? And so it suggests that maybe we're only good because we're scared of being bad. We don't want to get caught. But if we thought we could get away with it, maybe we would. And so justice, moral goodness of soul, righteousness, is not something we actually value for its own sake. We value it because, it works and we really don't want to get thrown in prison for committing bad deeds. So justice really isn't all that powerful. And if we really had power, we would pursue that. In which case, rather than teaching the Bible, we should be teaching Machiavelli's The Prince, right? And finding ways to acquire great political power. And Glaucon and Adeimantus, two friends of Socrates, bring this potent argument to Socrates and say, look, we bring this to you because we would like a solution to this problem. We don't know what to say. And Socrates' response is, well, guys, I'm puzzled by this too, because if I really believed that you thought this argument was sound, I wouldn't trust your characters. But the problem is, I know you guys, and you don't live like this. So what does this mean? Right? And it suggests that they know there's something wrong with the argument, and they want Socrates to help them investigate. And so Socrates says, okay, look, what we really need to do is figure out, is justice good in itself? We know it's good for other things, right? It helps you have friends in life, all these things. It helps you avoid prison time in normal world. That makes sense. But what about if you were in a situation where the just man got all the negatives of injustice put on him, right? A reversal of seeming and being, of appearance and reality. So the just man seemed to be unjust and got penalized, and the unjust man seemed to be just and got all the rewards. What then, Socrates? Would justice still be good? Is it truly valuable in itself or not? And so Socrates said we need to find out what justice is in itself and what it does to the man that has it, whether it escapes the notice of gods and men or not. So we leave all the gods and men out of the picture. What is justice and what does it do? All right? And so to figure this out, Socrates told us, well, justice is hard to see in the soul. I mean, that's why we're asking the question. If it was so clear, we wouldn't be asking this. So what if we found justice in an easier place to see? Something bigger, like in a city. And we all know that justice and injustice arise in cities. So if we knew that justice and injustice were there, we could see them in those larger places. Then if the city and the soul were similarly structured, we could look back in the soul and identify justice in the soul. And then we could solve our problem. And so we spent an entire class working on city building. And you might remember from our natural principles, right, that no man is sufficient in himself, and the one man, one job principle, that our natures are different. And from that, we generated all the different wealth-producing classes, and we called those groups of people our producers. But then we recognized that that made us a target for potential enemy attack. And so we needed some people who could defend our society, and we called these our guardian auxiliaries. Right? And they were people that showed a particular spiritedness from the time they were young. And we trained them because we realized that while, timber is an art, produces things, and cobblers clearly is an art, and apple growers is an art, we call war an art, but is it really an art? Because it's all very destructive. And it doesn't seem entirely natural. In fact, to get people to be able to do it, Socrates says, we kind of need to bend their natures, really to make them more dog-like, so they'll be really vicious toward our enemies, but really friendly at home with our little daughter, right? And that's the way dogs are. So how do you turn people into dogs? This is the problem, because it doesn't seem quite entirely natural. So we had to create a special kind of education system where we put them through rigorous gymnastics, which we found trained them in both body and soul to be team players, to be physically adept, to be excellent warriors. We realized we had to mollify that, bend that, order that with the right kind of imagery. So we wanted to give them the right sort of music, right? The right sorts of plays, not Born on the 4th of July, that horrific movie. Why would you ever show that to soldiers about to hit the enemy beaches, right? No, we would show them great works that the people that fought and they died, they were hailed by the gods and their family members, right? You say, but is that true? It doesn't make a bit of difference. What matters is this is what they need to do their job. Remember, we're the ones that put them in uniform. We're the ones that put them in the battlefield. And so we got to give them what they need to get the job done. And this is what all nations do for their armies. They bend them, they twist them a little bit to enable them to perform the task. Because again, it's not entirely clear that killing is an art. It's not clear that it's an art. Now, just for your own purposes, Elise and I had a mighty debate about this. Not a quarrel. This isn't a quarrel. We just get the wine bottle going and the debate heats up, all right? See, even the baby's concerned about this. And boy, we really went back and forth. We started to think, maybe it is an art. And the problem is death. That's the problem. Okay, real fast, just a little suggestion. You know these people that do not simulations, what's it called? Reenactments, right? You know what I mean?
You're like New England?
Yeah, you got colonial, you've got the people that do Civil War. In our country, that kind of Civil War. You've got the people that do Roman legionaries over in Europe, all right? This is a big deal. This matters to people. Or how about military simulations and tactics? Okay, you know, so many people are really intrigued by the history. They want to play act them out, gaming, all the simulations gaming. And then there's the actual art of war. It's clearly highly tactical. There's all kinds of elements. And so you're like, how can this not be an art? So what Elise and I were saying was, okay, in the kingdom of God, right? Remember, we had a lot of wine for this, okay? In the kingdom of God, where all things find their completeness, why couldn't we have full-on simulations of these battles, but nobody dies? Wouldn't you then get everything about war without death? Right? Isn't the death the problem? And then you get the leadership and you get the tactics and it would be like the ultimate athletic contest. Isn't that what draws men to war? It's that ultimate conflict. Julia, objection? Yes, it would be chess. You deserve a cookie. Oh, you made it.
Between the angels, can they die?
No, the angels can't die. That's an excellent example to put into the picture. Because they have war, but it's not. That would solve certain other problems we have with St. Michael.
Can't die.
Angels can't die.
Point.
Oh, that's good.
Warring angels.
I got to make sure Lisa listens to this class. All right. But you see what I mean? So war could be an art, and the problem is that death corrupts it. So it's possible. But yeah?
I would have to look at the definition of art, but I usually think of creating things. Like you said, destruction is like the antithesis of creativity.
Yeah, it seems so. And yet...
General could be an artist.
Right. But see, that's the thing. When we look at if you closely examine the battles of Alexander and Napoleon, but then especially Caesar, it is beyond imagining, if you've studied these, how incredible genius this stuff is. And not just genius, the human dimension of inspiring. Like his legionaries, he was trapped in Alexandria one time. 70,000 Egyptian soldiers, he had one legion, so that's about 6,000 guys. They couldn't even get on the walls of Alexandria because they couldn't man them all. So they went all the way back to the harbor and made a makeshift defense. And his guys were panicking, they were running out of water because of the Mediterranean Sea, it's salt water. And so he's just like, okay, did you think to dig a well? And they're like, no, we didn't think of that. Okay, Caesar never lost his head, ever. And he was in more dire straits than that sometimes. So it's an amazing thing, all right? And how do we have the admiration for people like this if it's just wickedness, right? So there does seem to be something about war that's not an art because it's destruction. But then on the other hand, it does seem like an art. See how this is a tearing thing? But this part of it, this part that Socrates is talking about, to come back to the argument here, is that we seem to have to bend nature. And the way that war damages our soldiers simply by fighting. I'm not just talking about the people who lose limbs, lose friends, who see too much. I'm talking about
sticking
the
to their
act
allotted
of
role.
killing damages us.
The principle of one man, one job,
all right?
that we had
It
at the
damages
beginning.
us.
What
And
is it that causes
that goes
all
goes
the
back to the
problems
death
and
thing
injustice
again.
in the sin?
But It's just different from other things. And to enable people to do it, we seem to have to bend them, and then we don't know how to put them back together again.
PTSD, yeah.
Yeah, it's a terrible problem. Terrible. So we realized we needed to do something in our education system. We needed to have them study music to try to move them through these healing arts, right? To deal with some of these things. We realized we have to have them study philosophy so they can distinguish appearance and reality in war, avoid deception and set traps for the enemy. Hopefully the Ukrainians pulling this off against the Russians, right? That kind of a thing. And lastly, no filthy lucre. They've got to be public-minded, no private ownership, wives in common, all these things. We realized that's a little bit of a red flag. Wives in common? What happened to family? Well, you're a warrior. The city is your family. Again, really pushing human nature, not entirely natural, right? And I mentioned to you that book 5, this is going to be raised as a major problem. So we'll get there shortly. And then, of course, we realized we had people that obey the laws. We have people that enforce the laws. We needed people that make the laws. These, of course, are our philosopher kings, our rulers that we pulled out of our guardian classes. They became our true guardians, and we had all 3 classes of our city. We then said, okay, we've got our city. Now where would justice be found? And we then found the 4 virtues in our city. Did we not? First virtue was wisdom, and a city is wise thanks to which part? The guardian, true guardians, the rulers, yes? And what does it mean when they have wisdom? What is its definition? Let me make sure this isn't Elisa. It is. I need to take this. Okay, she stopped. I'm going to call her back. She's away, and just in case there's a problem. She's here. Oh, she's good. Okay. Okay. I'm teaching now. Okay, we're good. Okay, where was I? Wisdom, yes. What is its definition?
Looking for the interests of the whole.
Yes, exactly. It's being possessed of good counsel for the good of the whole city, not just a part. Crucial difference, key quality, right? Secondly, what was courage?
Adhering to justice and the right, despite your baser instincts to do otherwise.
All right. And by baser, we can aim that in 2 directions.
Right.
Baser in direction of,
Well, in the virtue of courage, foolhardiness on one end,
and then?
cowardice on the other.
Correct. So we do not want them to be subject to hedonistic bribes, right? So against pleasures, but also against pains. Either side, fears, but then exuberance. And this is about a preservative, right? A preservative for what's true, lawful, and good opinion concerning things that are terrible, concerning the application of force. These people are dangerous, very dangerous. And so we need to make sure that they use this power rightly. Okay? So crucial virtue. Then, of course, and that, of course, was in our guardian auxiliaries, unquestionably, yes. And then we found the virtue of moderation, which definition is?
Balanced harmony.
It's a harmony, yes. Each part required it to recognize right rule, right? Clearly the producing classes and our guardian auxiliaries needed this, but we even saw that our rulers need it, because our rulers need to bind themselves by the laws they put on others, and they need to actually do the job of ruling, which we saw that given all power is given for the sake of those under it. Real political power is putting yourself into other people's problems when you get nothing for it. It is therefore a major pain in the neck. So why would anybody want to do this? Well, now that is the question, isn't it? Maybe they have a different definition of ruling. But our guardian auxiliaries, our guardian leaders, who we were going to try to draw when they're retired to become philosopher kings, they're going to be like, yeah, sorry, we're done. We've served the country for 35 years. We've done our bit. We're done. And we're like, no, you're going to serve 5 years as a ruler. If you don't, we'll put you in jail. They're like, okay, fine. 5 more years, I'll do it. We don't want people who want it. We want people who need to do it because it's the right thing, because they're good at it. Excuse me. People that have proven themselves by, remember Marius, all my wounds are in front. A demonstrated commitment to the public good. All right? So that was our definition, moderation. We need these people to rule and do their jobs rightly. And then finally, our quarry the whole time. What is justice in the city?
Happiness.
Well, now that's the full argument. But before we get to that, what was justice such that we can make the argument for happiness?
Everyone doing what their part is.
Yes, it was one of the starting principles. Remember? It's been rolling around our feet the whole time. It's the one man, one job principle. Do your own job and stop putting your nose in other people's business. We're like, how in the world is that a definition of justice? It doesn't make sense. Well, we think of justice negatively. We think of being just as not being unjust. But what is justice itself positively? In other words, what is the quality within you that causes you not to commit all the injustices? And we saw that the major damage to a city is when you have one class rise up in faction against another one. If each class does its own job, we're not going to have that kind of conflict, and we're therefore not going to have disharmony and potential difficulty. So, Socrates has in fact identified the form of justice, which we then proved the soul and the city are the same because they each have the same three structures, yes? Rulers, guardian auxiliaries, producing classes in the city. Then in the soul, what did we find? Reason, small, quiet, just like our rulers, the smallest part. Desire or appetite, raving, lunatic, crazy, loud, just like our producing classes. And then the big mystery. Could be this third thing that within the soul is like the guardian auxiliaries. And then we discovered we had this extra element, this spirited part, this enthusiastic function, this imaginative capacity that could be used by reason to ally itself with them, right? Form a great power and hold desire in check. And we notice that athletes and soldiers do this because of the extraordinary training they have. And we kind of envied that. We're like, man, imagine if we had that power in our moral lives, right? And we thought to ourselves, if we just could do things like study gymnastics and music and philosophy, why couldn't we pursue and put in ourselves that same key quality? Not bad advice, right? Maybe that's why we struggle with our desires, because reason is by itself. And if we would ally the spirited part within ourselves, we could become very powerful, overwhelm desire, and hold it in check. And those times when desire gets a little out of hand, which, we probably have some familiarity with trying to be good Catholics. Yeah? All right? So we saw then that there is this parallelism, and then we said, okay, what are the virtues in the soul? And we found that wisdom is the same, right? The goodness of the whole human soul, the whole human person, not just a part. And which part requires wisdom? Reason, spirited part, desire. Which part? Reason, good, okay? And courage, similar, right? Holding to what is true, even if we're threatened by fears, or we're offered rewards, and that part of the soul, that belongs to which part? Spirited part, very good. And then moderation, self-control, right? The worst part, responding to the better part, same definition in the soul, recognition of right rule. And we needed that in all three parts of our soul, just like we need that in all three parts of our city. See the parallelism? And then finally, justice is exactly the same. This harmony of the three parts, each part recognizing its job and doing its job and not trying to do the jobs of the other parts. Okay, not trying to reduce the soul to one thing. And in the history of philosophy, those of you who know this, you can see these monstrous errors, right? You've got the Stoics and Kant trying to reduce the whole human soul to reason. And then you get the critique of pure reason, and you get a morality which is totally divorced and absent from happiness. Nuts. On the other hand, you get the hedonists, right? They reduce the whole human soul to nothing but desire. I'm happy if I get whatever I want. But you're more than desire. How's that supposed to work? Right? That doesn't work either. Another monstrous error. But if we think about the good of the whole, we recognize there's all three things must be considered. And then we took that insight and we said, health of the soul must be like health of the body, right? And the body has an order according to nature, not opinion. And I gave you the example. What if I came in here and my arm was dangling off and the blood was spitting everywhere? And you said, man, we got to get you to the hospital. I said, oh, how dare you? According to my health values, I am perfectly healthy. How dare you judge me? You must be haters, right? Why can't we just have differences of opinion about health? And you're like, no, you don't understand. This is not a matter of opinion. This is a matter of science, reality, nature, what is. And you're going to die if we don't get you to a hospital, right? In the same exact way, just as there is a true natural structure to the body that must be observed that we call health and is not a matter of opinion, there is also a structure and order to the soul. With its nature that we just saw and proved as we went through books 2 and 3 and we saw this structure. And if we do not observe it, we're not going to be happy. Because the proper order of the soul is not a matter of opinion, it is a matter of nature. contrary to most people you ask nowadays about happiness in the United States. It is not a matter of opinion. It's not different strokes for different folks. If that were true, everybody would be happy. Why?
They can just define it.
Define it any way you want, right? And make happiness easy. I cross a line in my imagination. I cross that line, I'm happy, right? Nope, it doesn't work. So obviously it's an absurd doctrine, totally absurd. None of these ancient philosophers took such a thing seriously. But we don't teach those in the schools anymore, do we? No, we don't. Why? Well, now we know. Now we know, all right? So we thus discovered justice and we solved the challenge of the myth of the ring. Because if you get every single thing you want with your invisibility ring, but you do not have justice, you will never be happy. Why? Because you're only satisfying one part of the soul. And happiness is the good of the whole. And that's why people that pursue nothing but pleasure are perpetually bored. Okay? St. Thomas predicted this. It's all in the ancient texts, but they, of course, don't read them. All right, at book 5, just after this amazing argument, Glaucon and Automat to say, wait a minute, Socrates, what do you mean we're going to have women in common? How's that going to work? And they start seeing all the problems, right? Naturally, how's this going to work between the sexes? What are we going to do with the children? How are we going to prevent future incest? On and on and on it goes. Suggesting that maybe this is not a good idea. So, books 5, book 6, book 7, on it goes. And then we get to book 8, which is where I had you pick up. So let's go there. All right, so we reviewed our argument up to this point on 543C, top of page 222. And we're reviewing the argument. That's not hard. He said you were presenting your arguments pretty much as you were doing now, as though you had completed your description of what concerns the city, saying that you would class a city such as you then described and the man like it as good. And you did this, as it seems, in spite of the fact that you still had a finer city man to tell of. Remember, that's the non-feverish city he talked about briefly. Anyhow, you were saying that the other cities are mistaken if this one is right. Concerning the remaining regimes, as I remember, you asserted that there are 4 forms it is worthwhile to have an account of. What happened to my reasoning? And whose mistakes are worth seeing, and similarly with the men who were like these regimes. So that when we have seen them all and agreed which man is best and which worst, we could consider whether the best man is happiest and the worst the most wretched, or whether it is otherwise. And just as I was asking which 4 regimes you meant, Polemarchus and Adeimantus interrupted. That's how you picked up the argument and got here. What you remember I said is quite correct. Well then, like a wrestler, give me the same hold again, and when I put the same question, try to tell what you were going to say then. If I am able, I said, and in fact, he said, I really myself desire to hear what 4 regimes you meant. It won't be hard for you to hear them, I said. For those, I mean, are the ones having names. The one that is praised by the many, that Cretan and Laconian regime. Okay, so regime number 1, keep in mind the first great regime is the aristocracy, the philosopher-king system. This is ruled by the wise. What is it devoted to? Let's identify its end or purpose. Aristocracy devoted to what?
Justice.
Yes, and all of the virtues. So excellence in every art, right? And in the moral arts, that would mean the virtues. Okay, the second is that Laconian regime. Now things start to go bad, okay? The Laconians, of course, are more like, that's the Spartans. And this is a regime that they later called timocracy. Anyone know Greek? See, what do they teach them in the schools? Time in Greek is honor. So, here, ruled by the philosopher kings, things are starting to go wrong. Next step down, ruled by the guardian auxiliaries. And if the soldiers are ruling, what are they going to be interested in? Defeating the enemy. Hence, victory, honor in war, right? Good. All right. What's the next one? Yes. Good job. Oligarchy. And what are they aimed at? Very right. And of course, who's ruling in this time? We've knocked off our philosopher kings. We knocked off our guardian auxiliaries. Producing classes. Very well done. And then, of course, for the fourth regime, Socrates distinguishes our producing classes into two kinds. The stingy ones who make all the money, and then the spenders who consume, hence rule by the consumers, right? And this class is called, or this group, what's this regime? Democracy. And what are they devoted to as their end? Equality. And then finally, worst of all, arrows keep going down, rule by the one, tyranny. The end of this regime is what? What's its purpose or end?
Consolidate power.
Exactly, power. And so here we have the classic division that we started the whole course with, goodness versus power, right? Tyranny versus aristocracy. Now, you'll notice if you're familiar with Aristotle's taxonomy of regimes, and everyone afterwards, because Aristotle is the one who sets the standards, Aristotle divides them according to form. So for him, there's rule by the one, rule by the few, rule by the many, all right? And the good regime is rule by, you have a good version and a bad version of each kind. So monarchy is the good rule by the one, tyranny, the bad rule by the one. Aristocracy, the good rule by the few, oligarchy, the bad version. You understand the idea? Socrates and Plato are not looking at it like that. They're not looking at regimes according to their form or structure. They are looking at regimes comparing each other according to what they're after. So substantive analysis morally. Hence, we identify these purposes. Everyone see that? Okay, so don't get confused with the Aristotelian taxonomy that if you study political science, you might be more familiar with. Now, in each one of the regimes, we're talking not just about a regime, but also a soul. Because remember, each soul has a structure similarly, and you can see the errors in both. So what Socrates does in Book 8 is goes through each regime soul of each category. We've already dealt with this one. So this obviously is not in Book 8. This is Books 2 through 4, right? And shows the soul and the regime and how it came out of the last regime's errors. And this is why Socrates spends a lot of time on parenting, especially fatherhood, and how bad fathers create the next generation. Men, every one of you should be studying this. You have a son. You, too. Got any sons yet? Some of you? Sons, right? Okay. And if you have daughters, they're going to marry sons. Okay? So, boy, this matters. Okay? We screw up our children. Do you say, but don't they have free choice? Of course they do. Free choice based on the options they're presented with. Who sets up their initial options? We do. So, boy, this is an indictment on bad parenting, and it showcases it. So, it's going to be tough, but it's worth carefully reading. If you got a chance to read through Book 8, you saw these patterns. All right? Now, each one is interesting, but I want to talk about oligarchy to democracy, because if you carefully read the text, you realize, how did Socrates know what we're going to be like? All right? And the democratic regime is so like us, it's freaky. So that's where we want to start. We want to understand the nature of the democratic man and the regime and understand what it's pursuing. So let's jump over there. And we'll join Socrates as he talks about how it forms out of oligarchy. So let's go to 555b. Page 233 in our text, 555b. Okay, here we go. Ready? Then democracy must, as it seems, be considered next, in what way it comes into being, and once come into being, what it is like, so that when we know the character of such a man in his turn, we can bring him forward for judgment. In that, he said, we would at least be proceeding just as we were. Doesn't it, I said, the transformation from an oligarchy to a democracy take place in something like the following way? As a result of the insatiable character of the good that oligarchy proposes for itself, namely, the necessity of becoming as rich as possible. So for the oligarch, riches is the supreme good. Everything else gets sacrificed in order to acquire wealth. Now remember, Socrates is not saying that wealth is bad. But when it becomes the chief end, big problem. Just like in Christianity, wealth is not bad. If you're a wealth producer and highly successful, fantastic. That's one of the arts. We need people who are wealthy and wealth producers, just like we need scientists, just like we need doctors, just like we need auto mechanics, just like we need singers and pie makers. We need everybody. It's great. It's a tremendous, awesome skill. But we can always begin to deify our talent. Okay? And riches is notorious for this, in obscuring reality. When you make the pursuit of wealth your top priority, then what happens with your family? What happens with other things? What happens to you? You start to shrivel, right? Well, that's what's happening here. Let's see how. How, he says, I suppose that because the rulers rule in it thanks to possessing much, they are unwilling to control those among the youth who become licentious. And of course, we defined this last week as total lack of any restraining principle. A license to do whatever I want. Thus, the vice of intemperance. Well done. In order, by a law, forbidding them to spend and waste what belongs to them, in order that by buying and making loans on the property of such men, they become richer and more honored. How many of you remember when you first started college, you started getting all these credit card offers, and you didn't have a job? You say, yeah, it's almost like they were trying to get us addicted. Yeah, I remember when Julia was 5. She's here, so I normally do tell the story, but she is here. And I saw her in front of the TV watching, and this was before we had like streaming TV without commercials, okay? So the commercials came on for whatever cartoon she was watching. And she said, I want that. Next ad. I want that. Next, I want that. And I stopped her. I said, Julia, what's going on here? And we talked about it. She said, oh yeah, why do I want all these things? Just because they're presenting it to me. And she realized she was being tricked. I said, they're tricking you. She's like, Spirited Park got a little pissed off. I was like, there's progress, there's promise in this girl's soul. All right? So no restriction on spending. Right? You say, but if you want to maximize money, laissez-faire economy, you can't have restrictions. That's right. And what kind of society do you end up with? One devoted to wealth as a supreme good. But is that the best thing? That's the question, right? Again, isn't it by now plain that it's not possible to honor wealth in a city and at the same time adequately to maintain moderation among the citizens, but one or the other is necessary and neglected? That's fairly plain. Then, by their neglect and encouragement of licentiousness and oligarchies, they have sometimes compelled human beings who are not ennobled to become poor. Filled with debt, right? I suppose then these men sit idly in the city, fitted out with stings and fully armed, some owing debts, some dishonored, some both hating and plotting against those who possess what belongs to them, and all the rest too, gripped by a love of change. Now this is really intriguing. How many times have you heard politicians offer, we need change, and they don't tell you what it's going to be, but everybody grabs onto it. You're like, wait, change isn't good in itself, right? Isn't that what Lenin and Stalin said? We need change. Look what happened. Hitler said the same thing. We need change, right?
Heads roll.
Heads roll. It's mass death. This is not usually good. But these are gripped by a love of change because they're so pissed off that they've been screwed over by the system. They hate the system. They blame the system. And of course, they never blame themselves. You know how it goes, right? And they want to change it. And these moneymakers, these are the oligarchs with heads bent down, not seeming to see these men, wound with injections of silver any man among the remainder who yields, and carrying off from the father a multiple offspring in interest, they make the drone and the beggar great in the city. So they end up reducing the people in value. Very great indeed, he said. And at all events, they aren't willing to quench this kind of evil as it is bursting into flame, either by preventing a man from doing what he wants with his property, or alternatively by instituting another law that resolves such cases. What law? The one that takes second place to the former law and which compels the citizens to care for virtue. For if someone were to prescribe that most voluntary contracts are to be made at the contractor's own risk, the citizens would make money less shamelessly in the city, and fewer evils of the kind we were just describing would grow in it. Well, 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 what an idea. What if the loan maker was responsible for 50% of the debt if it failed? Do you think the people making loans might be a little more circumspect? Do you think we would have had the housing crisis of 2008, where massive loans were made to people who couldn't possibly pay them? And remember, and all these foreclosures occurred?
Yeah, and they know the bailout's coming.
They know the bailout. Well, yeah, especially now, right? So, and Socrates is saying maybe they should be handling more than 50%, like the most. In other words, when the goal is money, you do anything you can to get the money, even if you damage the people you're selling to. The consumer becomes a target because there's no limit to the quest for money. Far fewer, he said, but as it is, for all these reasons, the rulers in the city treated the ruled in this way. As for themselves and their own, aren't their young luxurious, without taste for work of body or of soul, too soft to resist pleasures and pains, and too idle? So they become fabulously wealthy, and we know what happens with second generation wealth, right? First generation are stingy, never spend a penny. They work, right? You know all the robber barons that we heard about in the 1800s, and our modern world is similar. And then the next generation live soft, pampered lives, right? They have the video of their sex lives on the thing. They wear fashion, they fly here and there, and it's drugs. It just never ends. Same exact thing. Same thing. But notice, no taste for work in body or soul. You know what that's going to do to our military, don't you? You're like, boy, I feel like we're reading the end of the Romans. And they came after the Greeks. And this could be our end. Remember, we're not a democracy, we're a republic built on Rome, not Greece. And look what happened to Rome. Pay attention. And haven't they themselves neglected everything except money making and paid no more attention to virtue than the poor? All right, so it becomes a disaster. So it leads to a conflict between the factions, obviously the poor and the rich, and they start to give offices out, if you go over to 557A, on the basis of an equal basis rather than true character quality. And so he says, yes, this is the establishment of democracy, whether it comes into being by arms or by others withdrawing due to fear. A situation in which the noble and wise are afraid to run for office is a regime that is heading toward self-destruction. In what way do these men live? I said, what is the character of such a regime? Okay, so we've seen how this comes into being. Now, what about the regime? For them, it's plain the man who is like it will turn out to be democratic. In the first place, then, aren't they free? Isn't the city full of freedom and free speech? Isn't there license in it to do whatever one wants? That is certainly what it said, yes. And where there's license, it's plain that each man would organize his life in private just as it pleases him. Now, as Americans, you're like, well, that sounds pretty good, right? Yeah. Keep in mind that we were built on not freedom, but liberty. You say, aren't those the same thing? No. I had an Englishman once correct me on this. He said, no, freedom and liberty are different. Freedom is anarchy. And you think about freedom. Like, yeah, there could be a no rule principle, anarchy, negation of rule, and liberty might be something else. But these people can't make that distinction. Then I suppose in that regime especially, all sorts of human beings could come to be. How could they fail to? It's probably the fairest of all regimes. Just like a many-colored cloak decorated in all hues, this regime, decorated with all dispositions, would also look the fairest. And many perhaps, like boys and women, looking at many-colored things, would judge this to be the fairest regime. In other words, it has every kind of human person in it because there's no ordering principle to try to get people to pursue a certain task. And so, next line, thanks to the license, each person does whatever he wants, and there's no compulsion to rule, 5557E, no putting the people who know what they're doing into making the wars, and then look at 555A and a half on page 236. And what about this? Isn't the gentleness toward some of the condemned exquisite? Or in such a regime, haven't you yet seen men who have been sentenced to death or exile, nonetheless staying and carrying on right in the middle of things, as though no one cared or saw stock in the land like a hero? John Stuart Mill wrote a book once, or an essay, I guess, called Of Civilization. And he lamented that the more civilized the people become, the more their capacity to do the things necessary to preserve their civilization fade, because they become too sentimental. And the richer and more vibrant and fair, like this democratic culture we're talking about become, the less capable you are to be the sentinel on the wall that acts when it's necessary, because you're too sympathetic. Example I use for my students. You know how under Ohio law, anytime they release child molesters into the community, they give you a notice and tell you where they live, right? So I'm from New Jersey. So when I came here and I found that out, I was like, oh, so what do? Then we form posses and we take them out? You know, why else would you give us their addresses?
Yeah.
And people are like, well, you're from one of the original 13 colonies. You know, that's not how we do things. I'm like, okay, so, you know, what do? We just know where they are. Like, what do you mean just know where they are? I said, if a circus lion got away from the circus, you would just let it roam around? Well, no. You take your shotgun up to protect your children? Yes. Would you form posses to take him down? Yes. Who's more dangerous to your children? Child molesters with their recidivism rates or an escaped lion? Crickets. Silence. It's weird. What's wrong with us? We see all these television shows about what life in prison is like, right? And it's terrible. Would you want to go through that? No. How many television shows you how victims of violent crime are faring 10 to 15 years after the crime? They get us to sympathize with the perpetrators rather than the victims, don't they? Think about how they treated child molesters in the ancient world, assuming it was even illegal, right? You say, well, probably violent dismemberment. How do you defend a regime when you lack the ability to kill? Because that is the nature of military power, isn't it? And you may not want to kill within your society. Obviously, we have this going on in Ohio right now with this death penalty thing. But the nature of political power is lethality. If you can isolate a person in a cage and you think it will be safe, whatever, maybe you can make special allotments for these people. But our police are carrying weapons, they're armed to the teeth. FBI guys carrying weapons, they're armed to the teeth. And our soldiers, we know they are armed to the teeth. And we have been death dealing by the tens of thousands every year since what? 9/11, right? It's the dealing with death. If you lose the ability to do that, how do you protect yourselves? That's what Socrates is talking about. And here's the point. Democracy, with its emphasis on sympathy and the lack of reason for discrimination, undermines your emotions to the point where you sympathize with the perpetrator.
I think also, at least here, there's like a notion that if you have some kind of vice, then you have no authority to say that somebody else should be virtuous. And so it's like if somebody does something wrong and you try to call it out, it's like, well, you also do X, so you can't do that. So then it's like, then there's no morality.
Or your vice isn't a vice, it's a medical condition.
Correct.
And we don't have moral language,
Yeah.
we have medical language.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're unwell in the sense that you lack empathy or whatever.
Yeah.
Which is an interesting trick of phrase, since we used to distinguish mental illness from moral illness, right? Interesting point. Maybe Socrates has got something here. But it gets worse before it gets better. Oh, it gets worse. Let's keep going. Keep this in mind. This regime's sympathy and total lack of pettiness in despising what we were saying so solemnly when we were founding our city, that unless a man has a transcendent nature, he would never become good if from earliest childhood his play isn't noble and all his practices aren't such, how magnificently it tramples all this underfoot and doesn't care at all about what kinds of practices a man goes through political action, but honors him only if he says he's well disposed toward the multitude. So all you need for public office is to say you believe in the people. Interesting. It's a very noble regime, he said. A little sarcastic. Then democracy, I said, would have all this and other things akin to it. It would be, as it seems, a sweet regime. One of the things I noticed about 15 years ago, all of a sudden, all my students, freshmen, you understand, in 18, 19-year-olds, were talking about kindness and sweetness. Like all morality was defined by the singing of Taylor Swift. And love had no place, right? Kindness is you just let people do what they want, grandfatherly. Love is what your parents do. They do not let you do what you want. Say, but that hurts. Right. Because this promotes hedonism, in which pain is the most evil thing. So the idea is to never allow anyone to ever feel any pain, any discomfort, right? And so it's a very sweet regime. Because hedonism is the philosophy of the system, because pleasure is the god. Well, you say, is well known. Okay, then, let's reflect. Who is this private man like? What is he like? So let's take a look then at the man. And we talk about, Socrates makes this astonishing distinction between the necessary and the unnecessary desires. Now, what is he talking about here?
Like food, there's certain they go through and say what would be a necessary
Yep,
desire. So like food,
right.
that's the one.
But we can have desires that can become twisted, correct? That aren't good for us. Remember, every desire at its core has a proper natural object. Neither Socrates nor we Catholics are pursuing the Jedi philosophy, the Stoic philosophy, the Gnostic philosophy you get out of Star Wars. That certain desires are bad in themselves, certain traits of human nature are bad in themselves. No. Every faculty, every aspect of human nature has a proper object, even your anger, right? Remember the spirited part that gets angry at the desires for constantly wanting to do what's wrong? And you're like, I've had it. And all of a sudden you say, ooh, the temptation faded. Yay, victory, right? Anger has its proper object. So that's not what we're saying. But definitely desires can become twisted and out of priority, out of order for us. And so we have to find ways to redirect them. But this man doesn't do that. He is unable to see that distinction. Let's see why. Go over to how this democratic man comes out of the oligarchic one at 559D, page 238 at the top. Let's say how the democratic man comes out of the oligarchic one. It looks to me as though it happens like this. When a young man, reared as we were just saying, without education and stingily, remember his father is an oligarch, tastes the drone's honey, and has intercourse with fiery, clever beasts who are able to purvey manifold and subtle pleasures with every sort of variety, you presumably suppose that at this point he begins his change from an oligarchic regime within himself to a democratic one. Most necessarily. Then, just as the city was transformed when an alliance from outside brought aid to one party, like to like, is the young man also transformed in the same way, when desires of a kindred and like form from without bring aid to one party of the desires within him. That's entirely certain. And I suppose, if a counter-alliance comes to the aid of the oligarchic party in him, either from the advice and scolding of his father or from other relatives, then faction and counterfaction arise in him, and he does battle with himself. Surely. And I suppose that at times the Democratic Party gives way to the oligarchic, and with some of the desires destroyed and others exiled, a certain shame arose in the young man's soul and order was reestablished. Sometimes that does happen, he said. But I suppose that, once again, other desires akin to that exiled ones, reared in secret due to, watch it, here we go, due to the father's lack of knowledge about rearing, came to be many and strong. At least, he said, that's what usually happens. Then, drawn to the same associations, their secret intercourse bred a multitude. All right, so what we've got is a boy who's being pulled by two different sets of friends, right? One group of friends is like, pursue your desires. Don't listen to your parents. What do they know, right? Pursue desire to the hilt. The other side, maybe your uncle, your father, some of your father's business partners, saying, you don't want to live like that. You want to be successful in life, not a fool, not a failure. Like, yeah, that's true. I do want to be like that. So you're pulled back that way. So you've got this war within the oligarchic side versus the democratic side, right? Back and forth. But then, even if the democratic side is beaten down, secrecy sneaks back in. And the problem is what? The father doesn't understand how to properly rear his son. Think about the so-called greatest generation, right? Came back from World War II. What'd they do?
A lot of babies.
Had a lot of babies, and what'd they start?
The sexual revolution.
Well, no, actually.
The kids,
Yeah, the babies.
It was the kids did. They did what?
Starting suburbs.
Yes, and massive business. Right? Huge, tremendously successful. Everyone suddenly was able to buy houses. It was probably the greatest economic boom in U.S. history. Notice what they pursued. Did they pursue virtue? Honor? Well, they kind of won that already. Wealth? Oh, you betcha.
Yeah, and work.
Work and wealth, right? The 50s generation. And then their kids, right, became the 60s radicals. Do you see the oligarchic man producing the democratic man? And they never were loved by their parents. That's how they felt. Because dad was at work all the time and he did not give his son time and love and teaching.
And yeah, and time's more valuable.
Time is more valuable. And so this caused this distress, right? You see what happens? See how Socrates was able to predict this exact move that we saw? And so the parent did not understand that how virtue in the soul works, because then he'd understand what's going on with his son, right? And finally, now it really gets bad. Finally, I said about 560 B and 3/4. And finally, I suppose they took the Acropolis of the young man's soul. Acropolis of the soul is what, Bart? That's the Agora.
The actual, like, temple structure, right?
At the very pinnacle of Athens, hence where the Parthenon is, right? In other words, the most defensible ruling part of the city. That's where it is in Athens, yeah? They took the Acropolis, the ruling center, the most defended position of the young man's soul, perceiving, watch it, empty of fair studies and practices and true speeches, those that are the best watchmen and guardians in the thought of men whom the gods love. So this man lacked proper education and proper practices, virtuous habits. And notice the speeches that rally and imagistically encourage a man. His soul is empty. Because, notice, he has nothing from an aristocratic education. A true understanding of what is the best, true, devoted to the true, good life, right? Wise life. It's just absent. He doesn't even have a devotion to honor. So all the great speeches from people like Thomas Paine and Henry V and all these great things that motivate and rally people, totally empty. All he knows is money, get rich. And these kids are like, well, my parents aren't happy, right? So what do you go to when this happens to you? Well, then in their absence, false and boasting speeches and opinions ran up and seized that place in such a young man. Indeed they did. Top of the next page, 560C. Doesn't he then go back again to those lotus eaters and openly settle among them? Remember the Odyssey? What happened with the lotus eating?
Fell into dissipation.
Yep. And nowadays we would call this drugs. Drugs. What happened in the 60s? Drugs. Right? Why? Because they're empty. They weren't loved. And they don't know why, and they don't understand. They feel the gap, and their friends say, try this, and they suddenly feel better. And they become addicted to things that serve their feelings. Because nobody ever told them there's a better path. You see? And if some help should come to the stingy element in his soul from relatives, these boasting speeches close the gates of the kingly while within him. They neither admit the auxiliary force, that's our guardian auxiliaries, nor do they receive an embassy of speeches of older private men, but doing battle, they hold sway themselves. And here we go. Ready? 4 things. They name shame, simplicity. They push it out with dishonor, a fugitive. Calling moderation, cowardliness, and spattering it with mud, they banish it. Persuading that measurely and orderly expenditure are rustic and illiberal, they join with many useless desires in driving them over the frontier. So the first thing they do is they come in and they name virtues, vices. They flip the virtue and vice definitions. Let's start with, look at each one of these. First, they name shame, simplicity, pushing it out with dishonor. Now, why should people be ashamed?
You do something against your conscience.
Do something wrong, right? And you feel guilt and you feel shame. These people want there to be no shame at all. Therefore, no guilt. So what do they say? They call it being simple. Ever hear people talk about Catholics as being provincial, naive, simple-minded? Notice there's no arguments there. It's called name-calling, right? But this is what Socrates is talking about 2,400 years before you've experienced it yourselves. where there ought to be the virtue of courage, now cowardliness and brazenness are being extolled, aren't they? And people that feel shame for what they've done are viewed as the foolish people. Calling moderation, there's our beautiful virtue of moderation, it is now called cowardliness, and spattered with mud they banish it. So moderation means you have self-control. You don't do everything everyone else wants, right? And so your friends, remember in my day they called you a chicken. I don't know what the word is now.
Square, vanilla.
A square, a vanilla person, all right? Names again, no arguments, all names. Playing hockey now? Yep, I'm not good at hockey. There you go. All right. Naming shame, simplicity, calling moderation cowardliness. So if you're moderate and you have self-control and you don't want to do this thing because you think this is probably not a good application of my life, my resources, my limbs, then you're the coward. When in fact, these people are being embracing an immoderate, two vices, and now the vice has replaced the virtue and the virtue is now the vice. Remember how your mom used to tell you, don't give in to peer pressure. This is what peer pressure is what's happening in peer pressure. These kinds of tricks. And for teens, unless they've been educated with this kind of education, all they have to go on is speeches their mom might give them, right, and some rallying. But imagine if our young people understood these principles. Then they would be the ones mocking the fools who do these things. They would instantly understand what's happening and not fall for it. Again, persuading that measurely and orderly expenditure are rustic and illiberal, they join with many useless desires and drive them right over the frontier. So measurely and orderly expenditure are rustic and illiberal. So what does this mean? Saving.
That you're too stern or rigid.
Too stingy. So instead of us valuing people that carefully save, invest wisely, measurely order expenditure, don't just spend, 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 that's rustic and illiberal. Again, it's this provincial attitude. When in reality, right, if we are careful with our money, we're more likely to be successful. Indeed, they do. So our virtues are turned into vices. But then, of course, the Acropolis is empty, so now let's see what happens. And now, once they have emptied and purged these from the soul of the man whom they are seizing and initiating in great rites, they proceed to return insolence, anarchy, wastefulness, and shamelessness from exile in a blaze of light, crowned and accompanied by a numerous chorus, extolling and flattering them by calling, here we go, insolence, good education, anarchy, freedom, wastefulness, magnificence, and shamelessness, courage. So now, we flipped the virtues and vices in the other way. So, what were our four things? What was the first one?
Cardinal.
No. Yeah, that's true. That's one of the virtues. But I mean, what is the errors here? Let's see. Yes. Proceed, return insolence, and what? Insolence they call good education. You see what I mean? So insolence. So here's the vice, the actual vice, being called by some sort of virtue term, right? Actually, there should be no scare quotes on that one. Good education. Okay, what's the next one? Good. Next. Magnificence or munificence. And finally, shamelessness. Whoops, this is supposed to be over here. Courage. All right, so let's start. Insolence. What is the definition of insolence?
Disobedience.
It can lead into that, but before you get to the disobedience, what's causing this? Yeah, being offensive, rude, right? That kind of a thing. So, how under this new system that the Democrats, I'm not referring to political parties, you understand what I mean? I mean, there may be overtures, but that's not the point. So, Democrats, lovers of democracy, how is what we would actually call insolence, are they classifying as being well-educated? In other words, how in a democracy is being well-educated actually turns you into being an insolent, rude person?
Because you appreciate things that are just social constructs, and you can get rid of them at your leisure, because it's all made up anyway.
Right. And therefore, everything from the past can be dismissed. What is the central principle that our young people in high school learn?
Tolerance.
Yep.
Intolerance has no tolerance.
Yep. But that's it. It's how there is no truth. Every single thing. How there is no truth. How there is no truth. How there is no truth.
Which is
And-
a lie.
Well, yeah, well, that's true.
And also a pretty strident truth claim.
Yes, it is indeed.
Also a pretty strident truth claim.
That there is no truth. So, yes, so philosophically, it's absurd, but this doesn't bother these people, does it?
No.
Not a bit. Because they haven't been trained to think logically. They've been trained to think one thought, which is there is no truth. And think about what that does to the youthful mind, which by its nature is designed to feed on substance. You just gutted it of all value.
So what happens if you ask them, is that true?
Well, you can ask them that, and they'll sneer at you.
Yeah.
Because every other teacher in the class has told them that such things are logocentric, patriarchal, and come from stupid, dead Greek white men.
Yes.
If you just understood that, you would realize that we don't have to pay attention to logic. They make a logical argument thusly. Okay? So what did I do to you? I just called you names again. But I didn't give you an argument. I ignored your argument. But that's the tropes that these kids learn. And so there's no point in reading the past except to criticize them in light of our modern, whatever crazy ideas we have. We look at the past and we immediately denounce them. And this means there's nothing to learn from books. Nothing. And that's why they don't want to read or study. Because what's the point?
I have a semantic question that's actually, I think, salient to this. So I've encountered the word thumos outside of Plato, but it pertained to like recognition from other people and the sort of spirited need to have other people acknowledge.
That's the honor principle that is the spirited part of the soul.
So that's still at play in all of these things then.
Yeah,
Because
definitely.
You're signaling to people that you are what society says is, a worthwhile, superior person. Like there's still recognition games going on. There's still honor games going on.
Honor is tricky because honor can be viewed on the one hand as that which makes you honorable, virtue, quality, excellence,
Recognition is
or it can be the being recognized whether you deserve it or not. So that's the ambiguity with, are you talking about being honored or honorable?
recognition.
We're talking about honorable, not honored. And the trouble is in each context we'd have to define exactly how we're using that term there. But both are in play at different points. So the insolence becomes what education we're left with once we adopt this democratic principle that all ideas are equal. And keep in mind, that's the key. It might seem like we start with the principle that all people are equal, all persons are equal, and definitely there's got to be some truth to that. In God's eyes, the love of God applies to all people. Equality under the law, right? This certainly makes a certain amount of sense. But after that, every form of equality starts to become completely crazy. Right? On the right, you'll hear people talk about equality of opportunity. How can you possibly have equality of opportunity? What about raw talent? It's absurd. And on the left, you have equality of everything. How could you possibly achieve that? And what's really interesting, James Fenimore Cooper wrote The Pathfinder, The Deerslayer, Last of the Mohicans, all those books back in the early 1800s, late 1700s. He wrote a book called Of Equality. And he talked about how Americans are completely confused on what equality really is. So all the way back then, we Americans were already all confused. So the seeds of this go all the way back there, that we start to think that every single idea is equal. But that's what truth relativism amounts to. Some ideas aren't better than others. I asked my students once, how many of you think that if you had a chance to do a study abroad and you go to Spain, that would be really good for you? You go there and you can learn all kinds of things from the Spanish, lots of things that would be beneficial to you that you could really use. 2/3 of the class raised their hand and said, oh yeah, I mean, that'd be great if we had the resources, right? That's always the issue. I said, okay, that's interesting. I said, what about a Spanish person? What about if a Spanish person, they had a chance to do a study abroad in the United States? Do you think it would be good for them that they should come here because we Americans have a lot of things to teach them because of our successes as a culture? One person raised the hand. Why?
Because we know, most, left and right don't like what America is. They just have different ideas of what it should be. But most people agree America's not doing good right now.
Julia?
We give up on our country.
Mm-hmm. How do you get a civilization to continue when the people no longer believe in it? And why do they believe Americans have nothing to teach? Because remember, 75 years ago, nobody would have thought that. Remember in the late 19th century, that original progressive era? It was like, we got the light bulb, we have the bicycle, we have the gasoline engine. Man, we are on the cusp of the future. And it's right here in the new world. We left the crazy old world, now we're going somewhere. And look at how it's changed. So, Socrates is onto something here. That we have lost the ability to believe in ourselves, and to be well educated now is to disbelieve in yourself. Which makes you unable to say that other people can learn from you. Which has to be crazy. Surely if we can learn from them, they can learn from us. It's got to be a two-way street. But again, there's that logocentric nonsense from dead white Greeks.
Wait,
Greeks weren't white, by the way.
so what was the answer you said? Why, like, your class didn't think they could learn anything? What
Yeah, they thought that the Spanish person should not be told that he could benefit from a study abroad in the United States.
Because
There's
racism?
nothing to offer.
Yeah,
Because they have there's nothing
because if American thought this, he would be imposing his values on this poor Spanish person. How dare we do that? There is no truth.
Yeah.
All ideas are equal. Therefore, how dare we impose our ideas on other people? Okay? Remember, education is not imposition. Education is a gift. You have a choice whether to accept it. There's no imposition. But for these people, to say that anything is true is itself an imposition, except for the claim that there is no truth. Of course, this is acceptable. But all the rest of them are dumped. So all of our young people learn is a series of tropes, series of tricks to convince themselves that they're never accountable for truth, which means they never have to change and they can do whatever they want. There are no limits. Now here's the question. Who sees that as a benefit? Keeping in mind the Socratic principle that this generation comes from the oligarch.
The tyrannical soul.
That's where we're going. That's not where we came from. Where did we come from? Right, but who's the prior regime before the democracy? The oligarchs. What were the oligarchs' primary objective? Wealth. If you want to make money, you want to sell, correct? Do you want people to have limits? When was the last time you heard somebody say to a salesman, yeah, but how is this going to make me virtuous?
There's a Spectrum commercial out there right now where the company comes in trying to sell the client their system. My system will make you go. He walks out the door, and next thing he's with the salesperson from Spectrum Business. And she customized the IT system to his needs, not their needs.
And if the understanding was that the true need was for a good soul, right? Some car dealers would be like, well, you don't need a car now. You're doing great. Right?
Yeah.
Take the bus.
Or yeah, maybe you can take a bus. It all depends on the situation. Obviously, there's a need for cars. Don't get me wrong. But the point is, how would the system work? If you were a salesman and you explained to your boss, you don't understand, I didn't think this was good for the client. It's not going to go well. If you think, well, I think I'm ripping people off, it's not going to go well. Right? It's not going to go well. So this is really intriguing. The businessman has the chance to make the most money if he eliminates all resistance to purchasing. How do you do that? We've seen one way. You make loans extremely easy to acquire. But the biggest hindrance to selling is grandma. with her old-fashioned ways and her ideas about ethics and responsibility. Right? How else do you have a multi-billion-dollar porn industry in this country? Have you done the math on how much money we spend on books vis-a-vis porn? It's not good. Right? I mean, it doesn't make any sense. If we said, well, how do I have become more self-controlled? It doesn't seem like we'd have billions on this particular thing, right? A few hundred million perhaps, but not billions, B. It seems big number. Right? So think about how this happens. And the oligarch wants to make everything the same. So that means what does he have to do? Eliminate all moral difference. So how do you do that? No moral limits, no moral rules. And so suddenly you can sell anything to anyone, and you don't make a difference between necessary and unnecessary desires. You don't make a difference between evil and good objects. You even start selling by means of vice. I don't know when this was on, but I remember at some point they had a Grey Poupon commercial, and they were overtly appealing to vices to sell the mustard. And they were so overt about it. It was like, wow, I can't believe it's gotten to this. I have no idea now. I don't try to look at the ones with the commercials. They drive me crazy. Except for the Super Bowl, of course. That's different. Right?
Commercials are weird now.
They're
no
weird.
longer aspirational.
Oh, really?
They're like sort of like trying to meet you at your low level. Yeah, like good-looking people in commercials. I haven't seen one in like years.
Oh.
It's very bizarre. I don't know what to make of it.
Maybe the audience has changed.
People who see advertising, like good-looking people aren't in advertising anymore. It's generally.
It's a fair point. You don't have like, I feel like you would have a Pepsi commercial where, you know, the athlete's running down or the girl's on the beach and then they're drinking this refreshing drink.
Drinking
right?
a beer and she's in a bikini. Like, okay, I get what this is supposed to be.
Right.
Versus now you have a bunch of fat people on the sofa being like, oh, my
Like,
cable's out.
Yeah, and like the message is like, the way you are, perfect.
Oh.
Like, we don't like.
So there's no aspiration. So
This
that,
doesn't judge you.
Yeah.
so you're saying that the principle of aspiration implied that there was still a quality of the beautiful that was better than being ugly, wealthy and successful that was better than being these other things. So even if truth wasn't in play, aspiration was. And now you're saying it's gutted. Why drink the beer at all then?
Great question. Well, why would you sell a women's razor that is explicitly anti-shaving?
Yeah.
Right.
So it's about the feeling you get, but it's not the feeling, aspirational feeling. It's the feeling from the beer itself, just the alcohol?
I could go on. I don't know how to speak succinctly about this, but I think that we become such sophisticated consumers
Yeah.
that like simple aspiration messages, we're like, oh, ha ha ha, you're trying to trick me into trying to be cool or sexy or smart. Whereas just like sort of like meeting you at your own like crappy couch potato level doesn't like inspire you to do anything, so you don't like your red flags don't go up, your alarms don't go off.
Yes.
But you do sort of like identify with like like this feeling, this comfortable.
Okay.
headiness.
So it's another attempt to bore or put to sleep the rational faculty for discrimination,
yeah.
the ability to make judgments.
You're talking about desire and what we want to do, but it's not what we ought to do. That kind of makes me think of that.
Yeah, but this sounds sub-rational. You're talking about something that's still at least on a reason versus desire scheme.
It's more
like reason has been put to
you're
sleep.
Scrolling and it's
Oh, yeah.
It's
Yeah, like
it's hardwiring the lizard
You've
brain.
been so decadent for so long that you're bored, and so you don't really enjoy anything anymore. You're just kind of in this like low energy hedonism. And
Hedonic adaptation is the term.
yeah.
Say the word again.
Hedonic adaptation.
Okay, I need to look that word up. You're going to send me that one, because I didn't know those terms. But if that's what it is, that's a good set of words to learn. Julia, what were you going to say?
Feeling of acceptance.
By whom? Who's getting accepted?
We're trying to get the commercial viewer to feel accepted.
Per se.
The kind of implied other of the commercial.
But I think you both are saying the right thing, because I work in marketing and
Oh, you do?
This like principle of
Perfect.
like don't be discriminant at all in your advertising is definitely pretty pervasive, which is insane because you're supposed to have a target,
Yeah.
right? Like you're supposed to have a target audience, and inherently, like your product is going to appeal to a certain
Presumably.
type of
And
person
you have
more
to
than
have someone
another.
depicting it. Like,
Yeah,
Right.
like a single bachelor is not who sells laundry detergent.
correct.
Who do
But
you
it's-
sell to?
I work for Bob Evans Foods, and so we sell to grocery stores. But then when we do advertising, it's toward the consumer. But, I mean, there's a certain type of person that's gonna buy refrigerated mashed potatoes. and
But they're still paying
refrigerated
attention to that though, right?
But when we do advertising, it's like, how do I show everybody in every,
So the advertising, the social idea of diversity and inclusiveness dominates even if it undermines your effort.
correct?
Does this work?
No.
No, it can't possibly work.
It's like,
Yeah, but see what's happened here. What this means though is that the principle of equality has taken over from the principle of making money. Yeah, which is Socrates' point. We're going from one to the other.
that's correct.
Look at how he sums this up. 561b. Then I suppose that afterwards such a man lives spending no more money, effort, and time on the necessary than the unnecessary pleasures. However, if he has good luck and his frenzy does not go beyond bounds, and if also as a result of getting somewhat older and the great disturbances having passed by, he readmits a part of the exiles and doesn't give himself wholly over to the invaders, then he lives his life in accord with certain equality of pleasures he has established. To whichever one happens along, as though it were chosen by the lot, he hands over the rule within himself until it is satisfied. And then again to another, dishonoring none, but fostering them all on the basis of equality. So the key principle is the principle of equality, that nothing that I feel within myself should ever be criticized, and I should pursue it to the hilt no matter what. If I feel it, I'm born this way, and that's game over. And how dare anyone criticize me? Right?
So it sounds like when we hear democracy as Americans, right, there's like a rah-rah component, granted that we're a republic. But what I'm hearing in this is very much a critique from what I would say would be traditionally the left, or like the communists, the Mao.
Of the
like,
left.
Of the left,
Hey,
right?
hi.
Of, you've got this wealth inequality, and then pushing that down.
Yes.
Is there any way where we would say like the traditional spirit of '76 founders is identifiable in this version
Yeah.
of a democracy, or
When you go back to that era, you find a mix.
okay?
Okay, so you've got George Washington with an extremely aristocratic temperament who gives up absolute power. Before the Constitution is formed at, I think it's Newburgh in New York, the army was pissed off at Continental Congress not paying them, and they wanted to mutiny and take over the country and set him up as king. And he comes out with this rallying speech, takes off his glasses, talks about his wounded eyes. We didn't do all this. I didn't lose my eyesight for this. We're going to stick to the rule of law. And then he lives this out. So anytime your leadership puts themselves under the law, sacrifices themselves for the principle and the good, that's when you've got something amazing. So
that would be more the aristocracy.
that's aristocratic.
Then, like the democracy component is
But-
kind of just an all one rock.
Correct. But like I'm saying, we see it all then. You also have the people who are after expansion. Let's invade Canada. Let's try to do these things, right? Let's fight with France against Britain. And you had Jefferson and the Francophiles wanting to side with the French, and you had Adams and the Anglophiles wanting to side with the English. Adams, initially, yeah. No, Hamilton. And Adams follows Washington's principle of neutrality. He becomes president, beats Jefferson, right, in that second election, and he continues the pursuit of the neutrality policy. But boy, this is democratic aspects, right? They need us. We have to fight wars. And the neutralists won out, and that held sway. Remember the 19th century history? How many European wars occurred in the 19th century?
None that we can.
You don't know. Because when you studied American history, you're like, that wasn't in our book. That's right. 7 major full-scale wars. Like World War II, except only in Europe. They have always been killing each other. That's why we left. Right? And the principle of Washington is, don't go back. And then 20th century history, you know all the wars in Europe, don't you? I wonder why. All right? So you see this democratic principle engaged. You also see the oligarchy principle. For sure, the people that are trying to make money, right? All this stuff, clearly available. The whole point is we're a commercial republic. We sell to both sides in a war. Our goal is to make money, freedom of the seas, all these principles. And you have the democratic mob style, which is also at work with we want equality, we want things, we want our rights. And so,
It's that balance, that fighting factions that was initially.
yeah, you got it all. You got it all. Yeah, and that's part of James Fenimore Cooper's point. America is a mixed bag. And that's part of the reason the founders chose a republic, because we're so passionate, we're easily open to demagoguery, And the best thing you can do for Americans is to slow us down. So you create a bicameral legislature, so everything has to go through two houses that have different spirits entirely, right? You just slow it down. And this, our founders thought, given our nature, would be wise, and you can see what they weren't wrong. So I think you see all of them there. All right, so the key principle is the principle of equality, the equality of ideas, the equality of pleasures. Nothing is any better than anything else. Nothing is any truer than anything else. And when that principle is put forward, what happens to your people? What happens to your regime? Next paragraph. And I said, he doesn't admit true speech or let it pass into the guardhouse. If someone says there are some pleasures belonging to fine and good desires and some belonging to bad desires, that the one must be practiced and honored and the others checked and enslaved, rather, he shakes his head at all of this and says that all are alike and must be honored on an equal basis. And think about what happens if you lose rational principles of discrimination in your life. If you can't sort truth from error, good from bad, right? Beauty from ugliness. There's no principle that helps you guide your life. And so you are now caused. You're not free. To be free means to choose according to reasons that are given and to select between them, which is better. If you eliminate that principle, you are just being impelled by whatever desire drives you. And that makes you what? Subject to, I've lost my things. What was on the board? Tyranny, right? You are totally vulnerable to tyranny because now you are vulnerable to the application of power. And that's what we get in the next page. All right. I think we might have skipped over wastefulness, magnificence, shamelessness, courage, but something tells me you can see those principles in play, yes? Okay, any questions about the democratic man and the democratic regime and how we emerge out of oligarchs and then find ourselves sliding into tyrannies?
I actually have a question on how we slide from aristocracy to the democracy, because it seems like honor is one of the virtues, right? So
No,
is it just
not honor.
Okay.
And it goes to the ambiguity he was suggesting to us earlier. Being honorable, why would you be honorable? Because you had virtue.
Okay.
Yes, same thing. Being honored, you could be honored without being honorable.
Okay.
Like victories in war,
Okay.
right? You do this great thing, you achieve this immense victory. How'd you do it? Oh, I just slaughtered this whole city, you know. Well, that's kind of dark. Yes, it is. So honorable, and once that ambiguity gets in there, right, and you start to lose the wise, the ability to carefully delineate these things, then victory for its own sake starts to become the objective.
This is kind of pessimistic, but it seems like the directionality of this process only goes one way.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's my students always ask, how do we recover from this, Dr. Thiel? I say, well, Socrates' answer is non-political. If you read the Apology, the other early dialogues, yeah, it's individual. He thinks it has to function on an individual to individual basis to inspire them through philosophical questioning, dialectic he calls it, to pursue a good life. And by that means, he thought that the gods gave him to Athens as a gift to start to slowly reignite the desire for truth. Ultimately, you could argue he was proven right. But of course, along the way, he got taken out by a democratic Athens. Do you understand why those Athens hated Socrates? Boy, you read this, you get it. Makes sense, right? He was absolutely. And he was persuasive because we're still reading these books, some of us.
Did you put that poster up today too?
No, I didn't think of that one.
Here last week as well.
Look at that. Good Catholics, right? So, yeah. Yeah, I don't know where I was just thinking there. What was the argument?
Well, the desire for truth, Socrates. So
And the
he
directionality of
basically
Yeah, the
said-
directionality. So I don't see, Socrates thinks that politics is a dead end. He thinks we have to go person to person. Trying to change the form of the government doesn't change the substance. And whatever the form is, if the people in it aren't good, it's not going to matter. Some forms are better than others, or slower than others. But in the end, goodness is the key quality. And every single generation has to choose it for themselves again. So that's why we're in this constant feeling of, what's going to happen? Every generation feels that way. All right? So that's part of the answer. But from a corporate standpoint, as a whole, what is the only thing that we ever seen really transforms societies? And I only know two things. Number one, conquest on a massive scale. And I give you the example of what happened in Japan at the end of World War II. Okay, they lost their God, for crying out loud. He admitted on radio, oh, by the way, guys, I'm actually not a god. The whole thing, you know, the emperor, not really right. And they were absolutely devastated by bombing. All their cities were wiped out. The atomic bomb was just 2 cities. They were destroying cities, the American Air Force, every night, blowing them to bits. The Japanese were irrevocably changed, and yet not thoroughly. You can still feel traces of ancient Japan even now. It's fascinating. But significant change. Post-Nazism, World War II, you also see huge changes. But again, massive psychological trauma as a result of horrific slaughter and losses as a result of war. So it's possible to argue that conquest can change people. But even that's fraught with difficulty. The other way, of course, the other form of conquest is voluntary, which is conversion. You can see the history of our faith as it goes and transforms countries. And even if not everybody in them embraces it or they later abandon it, you can see the impact of the faith on these countries. They still have attitudes toward their neighbors, and they don't even know why, right? Because other countries that were never Christianized don't think that way, but they do. So clearly, Christianity has a revolutionary impact on political compacts, political communities. So if we merge those together, the Socratic answer, if he had the insight of the faith too, would be we need to be exemplars of the good, both the religious good and the political good and the ethical good to the people around us. And we are the ones who will draw people toward a different kind of life. Or they'll kill us. That's the option.
Well, attraction rather than promotion.
Well, yeah, in a certain way, but it's not like you couldn't have a political action too. I'm not saying we shouldn't do civic action. If you want to run for office, that's a wonderful and noble thing. But Socrates thinks that the real impact is going to be made on an individual to individual level. And what we see in RCIA, the people coming into the faith, it's so often, it's person to person. So you become lights, and people will look at you and say, I don't know what it is, but there's something about you. Maybe it's because you pursue the real, the true, and the beautiful. And that makes you an attractive human being. You're like, now you got that right. Okay? So I think that's the direction we have to go. And also, we've got to teach our children the actual history, not what's being propagandized, and keep alive the old, in my view, it's the Renaissance. We've got to keep that merger of classical Greek thought with Christian thought. The Renaissance is not, to my view, the beginning of the Enlightenment. I think this is a total misreading. The Enlightenment is the rejection of the Renaissance. The Renaissance is the fruition of Christianity mixed with classical culture. There were 2 other ones earlier, Charlemagne's and then the one in the 1200s, both of which were destroyed and ruined by Viking invasions, the Black Death. Every time I got going, there was a new disaster in Europe, until finally the Italians knocked it out of the park with the banking system, right? And then you saw art and science like the world has never seen, and all in one city, Florence. How is this possible? Well, I think I know, right? And that's a whole nother class someday in the future. But if we could recreate that spirit, so we're putting up great sculptures and doing classical painting and composing fantastic music, right? He's a composer, right? This is what we need to be doing again. And because my students were all, raised on so-called contemporary art, right? And I'd say, well, there's other things. Yeah, sure, Dr. Teal. I took them to Florence. Like, oh. Once they saw Michelangelo, once they seen the Raphaels, right? Like, now I know why this commands $400 million. And what I did on my canvas at home is worthless. Yes, exactly. Apparently, suddenly they know the difference between beauty and ugliness, right? It's not so important anymore. Yep. All right, great class. So we're going to read in book 10. Okay, there's a little part of book 9 that I will send you because, wait a minute, do I have it right here? You're going to love it because it's on the immortality of the soul. Okay, here we go. So, 587E, I will send this to you. So read that section, and then 608B through the end, 621D. And the end is weird. I'm just going to tell you this right off the bat. There's a myth. You're going to be like, what is going on? That's the right question. and see if you can figure this out, because, oh, it's going to be a dazzling ending to this. That's all I'm going to tell you now. Come back next week. All right, see you next week.